Welcome to the One Shot Show where GMs go to level up. I'm Paddy. I'm joined as always by Matt.
And there's something about how you said that just really makes me want to punch you in the face, Paddy.
But I'm a pacifist.
Oh, well, I think you're going to have a really hard time playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition because, as we've said before, all of the rules in that system govern combat.
But I don't want to fight things. I want to have fun elsewhere.
What are we to do?
It's the real problem. Do you ever have this quandary as a player? I have it more often as a player than a GM, where I'm like, this doesn't sit well with my values, what's happening at this table. Or it is so interesting because wargaming is the origin of a lot of our tabletop role-playing. And wargaming, as the title implies, was we were reenacting and rediscovering actual battles of the past.
Exactly. That's not a metaphor. Like, wargaming originates around the Napoleonic era, where Prussian tacticians...
Oh, that's right. And it was like a training strategy.
Exactly. It was a huge part of how they actually trained their command structures because nobody was as good in the field as Napoleon. It came from the very real practice of needing to kill the other side's men better than they're killing yours. And now, look, we've abstracted long since from then. There's very little at the table in Warhammer 40k that is going to feel that grounded and realistic. However, it is from wargaming, from chainmail, that Dungeons & Dragons, which is sort of the prototype for tabletop RPGs, finds its genesis. By the way, if you want to read a really interesting book on that shift from wargaming, the sort of early wargaming-y days of D&D into what we would think of now, look for a book called The Elusive Shift. Incredible piece of literature, 100% recommended.
Yeah.
But you're right. We are still on some way building from that legacy.
Yeah.
What if we want to part with it whole cloth? What if we are uninterested in fighting? We're uninterested in violence. We're uninterested in combat. It does not mean we're uninterested in conflict, but we don't want to have to bear arms about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the key to it. I find that if I'm coming at a table to tell a story with friends, we need some form of conflict. We need some sort of drama to move forward. And I have seen, to greater and lesser degrees of success, other forms of conflict introduced at tables. I've introduced them myself. I want to start at the beginning. Primarily, we often talk from our baseline of talking about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Inside that system, what success or failure have we had running non-combat?
I've had absolutely none, but I met a very interesting gentleman a number of years ago who had picked up... This is around when professional GMing was starting to become a bit more of a known thing. You might start finding games at your local library. He was a professional GM, and he'd been hired to run games for prison inmates. And it was a hard line that there could be absolutely no fighting or violence in the game. Now, at this point, this GM only knew how to run Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So he had to take a game where most of what is in there is about fighting. You couldn't even mention swords, and even the possibility of violence was an absolute non-starter. So what did he do? He created a world that baked that into the rules, right? On a very fundamental level, if you engaged in violence, you effectively got thrown in prison, which is something that these prison inmates really understood the price of and were not interested in doing. They didn't want to roleplay being in prison. They were already in prison. I wish I'd had a chance to talk more with him about how it all went and how it all played out, because it's such a fascinating place to start from, that no matter what, no matter how strong you are, no matter how much magic you know, you always have to start from the position of de-escalating. Now, the way he phrased this was he therefore didn't center fighting in his conflict. We didn't get to talk more about that, but to my mind, that means things like political subterfuge. It might mean things like infiltration. They also wanted to, in this particular instance, avoid anything that leaned too much on criminal behavior, so things like heists were out of the window. But there was actually still a lot that you could do, and it ended up being that it was just leaning more and more on role play in that very free-form way that people who are familiar enough with 5th edition have sort of built up the bed of knowledge to be able to do and support. It's it's less, I'm going to use these spells that are very role play heavy. There are a few of them, but most of them are for combat. And by all accounts, it was extremely successful to the point where, to my understanding, that system has been launched into other prisons that are owned by the same American company. Paddy, what's your success with non-violence in video games been like?
It's in video games.
Sorry, goodness, in tabletop RPGs.
We play a lot of cozy
Candy
games
Crush.
at home. Candy Crush.
Even
Animal
Stardew
Crossing.
Valley has fighting now. God.
Yes, I was surprised when I was watching my partner play Stardew, and I was like,
With their
this
sword?
Is this a dungeon? Yeah, I was really, really surprised. Yeah, I love that idea of you create a world that is around that. I also I had a really beautiful long run with my players at the table where there was conflict, but it was man versus nature conflict. We were on a long hex scroll. We were going through a jungle, and at one point, a player remarked to me, "Was like, we roll initiative like surprisingly infrequently," and I realized that what I had designed on the page for the sessions, be they scripted or rolled, often involved different kinds of conflict. We had one of my favorite memories is of a River Rapids episode that we ran. They were inside. They were in boats. They got stuck in the rapids, and they had to use their character sheet in interesting ways to overcome that challenge. So yeah, man versus nature was, and then yeah, in hindsight, I go character versus nature is such a huge pillar of all storytelling.
Yeah. The thing that's so interesting about that is it immediately reminded me of a half dozen times where I've had something very similar where there's been an environmental hazard and a thing that my players are trying to overcome. And I realized that every single time I've done that, it's also been concurrent to a fight. So it's been, you come across this natural obstacle, they start tackling the obstacle, and a third of the way in, someone starts, they're crossing the rapid river, someone starts lobbing arrows from the embankment.
Yes.
And I realized that it's never occurred to me that I could just pull the combat out of that and it would still be just as tense. And again, the reason is, I actually wanted to mention this in our last episode, we didn't really get the time when we were talking about different systems. You'll play to what's in the book. Right?
Yeah.
You'll play to whatever the rules tell you to do. There's an induced demand element to it. If what you have in front of you is a lot of rules for combat, you're probably going to do combat. If what you have in front of you is a lot of rules for exploration and overcoming natural hazards, you're going to do a lot more of that than you are of combat because that's what's there in the book.
Yeah, I'm running a lot of Daggerheart at the moment, and alongside their monster manual, in the same formatted stat block, they have environments. And environments contain all of the same things. It's so exciting. It plays on hit points and stress, which are two of the main mechanics. There are ways of overcoming. There are little magic bullet solves that if the players can think of, give them great advantages. And they're as concise as a monster stat block, but it's like the cliffside ascent, the river crossing. All of these things are statted out in the same way that I'd never experienced in 5th edition. Though I do 4th edition traps and things do have stat blocks, and I love them for that.
Because they're better.
I stole some. I was running against the Giants, which is a very combat focused environment, but also has 3 incredible environments to move through, and also that motion through environment was part of the great success of that. We think of social conflicts as well. And, again, 5th edition, not much on the bones. We've spoken in the past about other systems that have. Have you ever, have you run, big intrigue? I feel like you would love intrigue games.
I have done a big intrigue. I've only done it the one time, actually, where I did a really big intrigue arc. And, again, this is where I had to build a lot on top of it. But this was very low combat, this entire arc. They did have a few instances of it because, to be honest, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. My players are expecting fights from time to time. They're going to get frustrated if we go too long without one. End of. I've got to deliver what my players actually want at the end of the day. It was a very straightforward thing. In this particular setting, firearms had very recently been sort of developed to the point of mass production. This was meant to be the big game changer for this war that was brewing on the horizon. And a shipment had gone astray. They were sent to, the big city to try and track down this shipment. What they ended up in the immediate middle of was a city in political decline. There was a gangland conflict. There were various other factions looking to otherwise take control and vie for power. There was sort of a fresh captain of the guard who was a real hardline. There was also the previous captain of the guard who had clearly been assassinated. And I just put all these pieces on the board. They all had their own agendas. I developed all of the things that they were each into, what they were trying to accomplish, what their goals were, some of their connections, things they knew, who the key players in each of those things were. And I also had, I didn't put this down like, at this point, this thing will happen, at this point, this thing will happen, but I did have at the back of my mind, here's a bunch of things that could happen.
Yeah, I love
Maybe
that.
the new captain of the guard also gets assassinated. Just things that would be interesting twists and turns in a political intrigue situation. And then I deployed whichever ones either made the most thematic sense based on what had just happened, or would provide the most dramatic shifts given where things were headed. If it seems like the sailing is too smooth in political intrigue, you got to throw a rock in the water. You've got to shift things up. You know, they're finally starting to clean up all the crime. That's when the captain of the guard gets assassinated. Or they've sided with the gangs, and that's when the captain of the guard gets assassinated. And then the players go, oh, we didn't really want that. Let's maybe not side with the gangs so much. And they ended up deciding what they wanted to do, who they wanted to side with, because at the end of the day, the only stake they actually had in this entire conflict was that they were looking for information, and everyone in that city would go, I'll give you information. What are you going to do for me?
And then you end up with that. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm realizing as you say this as well. So, like, combat has a mechanical bedrock that you can always rely on, and we come back to it. What we're relying on as our bedrock for this are like, how are you, like, as a GM, how flexible are you as a storyteller? How willing and ready are you to either find a mechanical consequence for what these players are doing, or more often, like, how ready are you to be on your toes to create a story consequence for what is happening?
And the thing I like about political intrigue as an example of this is compared to other non-violent, non-combat situations, it actually doesn't rely on the role-playing skill of the people at the table.
Yeah.
And I do think that's where some of these non-combat oriented encounters sometimes fall flat. If the idea of a non-combat story beat is a tense negotiation, and there's not necessarily rules to support negotiation, it's reliant on how good everyone is at role-playing. And not everyone is fantastic at role-playing. I know that, I mean, yourself and, to be candid, a lot of the guests that we have on the show as well, they tend to play with actors, they tend to play with theatre kids, those sorts of people. I don't. I play with grognards. I'd love to play with theatre kids, don't get me wrong. I'm a theatre kid myself. But I've got to run for the table I've got. And that means political intrigue was great because they know stories. They know spy thrillers.
Yeah.
You know, they've seen plenty of that in their time. Yeah, usually there's action to sort of punch up those kinds of movies as well.
Yeah.
But it meant that it wasn't down to that moment-to-moment granular interaction.
Yes.
It was about wider decisions and the next actions that they would push them towards, like, we need to do this task for this person so that we can get this bit of information or this bit of financing or unwind this bit of conspiracy. And that would usually be, you know, break into this house, find this thing. Sit in on this particular, meeting of political agitators. Shut down this meeting of political agitators. Intercept this shipment at the docks that's going to have security. So some of those could be very combat-y, some of them were less combat-y, and some of them were set up in such a way that if things went wrong, they would devolve into a combat, which you very much wanted to not have happen.
Yeah.
And I actually think that final piece there is one of the most interesting things about non-violence and non-combat, is the idea of running games where combat is possible and it exists, but it is inherently a fail state. If you reach combat, you've already failed. Even if you win that fight, there will be lasting consequences. And that, to my mind, is the peak of actually running non-violent games because it allows for that combat to still exist.
It's what your friend is when you that the anecdote from the beginning of the story to go, like, you create a world where it's understood that that violence is, like, when it happens, like, the consequence is immediate, undesirable. You know, and as it is in, like, lots of fantasy work, but also in the real world, like, the consequences are tremendous for it, which is, I suppose, not the given assumption in most D&D settings.
You can fight anyone. Have you ever run one of those games where, like, session one of your punk-ass players, you know, the guard is, like, a bit arrogant because he's the only guard in this tiny village, and immediately the rogue is like, I punched the guard.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, for goodness sake.
It's,
Would you do that in real life? Would you punch the bouncer because they said, nah, mate, you're too tagged? I know people who have been declined from clubs they weren't even trying to get into just because they were walking past with the limp and the bouncer gave them some lip. Are you going to start throwing hands? Get out of here.
And the thing that gets me often is that I'm surprised how quick a player will go there, because I go around the table for fantasy, and it's truth and violence is a fantasy we don't get to play out in our real lives.
Yep.
But I'm surprised how we can only often assume that is the only fantasy we are fulfilling as GMs or as a table of role players. There are so many others.
And that's actually something that I think people who play a lot of big RPG video games that have an element of open world choice, I think very intuitively understand. Is look, you get people like on one playthrough, you might decide you're going to play through as the asshole that just like fights their way out of every situation, and in other times, the fantasy that you're trying to fulfill is working hard to uplift those around you, right? Like that's generally what I am. Like, I don't like playing, the absolute asshole who's just the most powerful guy on the block in like big open world RPGs.
Yeah. You don't play the edgelord in an RPG.
My power fantasy is to, I guess, uplift everyone around me. My power fantasy in real life would be to give my family and my friends wonderful lives and money, and I'd buy them all houses if I could.
Yeah.
So when I'm playing a video game that lets me do that or kill everyone, I'm going to buy all my friends' houses because that's the fantasy I'm trying to live out.
Blessings upon you. Hey, this was a great topic. Games without combat. I'm really curious, and I feel that we only scratched the surface of like how you can make your game exciting without needing to swing the sword.
I mean, there's whole episodes we could do on political intrigue, on what other non-combat encounters
I wrote down
look like.
investigative.
Yeah.
I wrote chases. These are ways, and chases are very hard, I find, to like really make exciting. But this episode is over. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
If you're enjoying listening to The One Shot Show, why not support us on Patreon? Go to patreon.com/OneShotShow, where you'll be able to find video versions of our episodes, long-form bonus episodes that we release every single month, access to our community Discord server. You can pose questions for our special Q&A episodes, and if you're back at the higher tiers, you can even vote on what questions we cover in our show. Check it out.